June 4, 1942. 10:24 a.m. Pacific Ocean, 200 miles northeast of Midway Atoll. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the command bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, surveying his Invincible fleet through Zeiss binoculars captured in Singapore. Around him, in perfect formation, sailed the four largest aircraft carriers in the world: Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū. Together, they carried 248 aircraft and the most experienced naval pilots on the planet. In the 6 months since Pearl Harbor, this force had known no defeat. They had sunk 5 British battleships in the Indian Ocean, destroyed the British Eastern Force at Ceylon, and annihilated everything that dared oppose them across the South Pacific. The Kido Butai, the mobile strike force, had traveled 50,000 miles in 6 months without losing a single capital ship. Nagumo allowed himself a brief smile. Below him, in the hangars, his crews were rearming aircraft with torpedoes for the final strike against the American carriers that reconnaissance had detected. It was a matter of minutes until launch. Victory was inevitable. What Nagumo didn't know, what none of the 10,500 sailors aboard those 4 ships could possibly imagine, was that in exactly 6 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy would cease to exist as an offensive force. 6 minutes, 360 seconds that would transform 4 floating fortresses into funeral pyres, kill 2,155 of Japan's finest naval aviators, and shift the balance of the Pacific War so dramatically that historians would mark this moment as the turning point of World War II. This is the story of how absolute confidence became absolute catastrophe, how Japanese pilots laughing at American incompetence went silent forever, and how the mathematics of industrial warfare destroyed the samurai spirit in less time than it takes to boil water. Act 1. The Invincible Armada. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor had been a masterpiece of naval aviation. 6 carriers launching 353 aircraft in 2 perfectly coordinated waves. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, 2,403 Americans dead, and Japanese losses so minimal they seemed almost fictional. 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, 64 men. But Pearl Harbor was just the beginning. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, stood on Akagi's bridge on December 8th and recorded in his diary what would become prophetic words: "We have awakened a sleeping giant, but for now he stumbles in darkness. We must win the war before he finds the light." What followed was 6 months of victories so complete, so one-sided, that even American naval historians would later describe it as the most devastating series of naval defeats in United States history. December 10th, 1941. Japanese aircraft sank the British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse off Malaya. Winston Churchill would later write, "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock. The British Navy had been invincible for centuries. In 3 hours, Japanese aircraft proved that the age of the battleship was over." January 1942. The Philippines fell. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Dutch East Indies collapsed in weeks. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, fell in February with 80,000 Allied troops captured, the largest surrender in British military history. But it was the April 1942 Indian Ocean raid that truly demonstrated the Kido Butai's terrifying power. On April 5th, Nagumo's carriers launched 91 aircraft against Colombo, Ceylon. They sank 2 British cruisers HMS Dorsetshire and HMS Cornwall in 19 minutes. The British ships, caught without air cover, were obliterated by dive bombers that achieved hit rates exceeding 80%. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, flying a D-3A Val dive bomber from Akagi, recorded the attack. It was not warfare. It was execution. The British ships had no chance. Their anti-aircraft fire was pathetic compared to what we faced at Pearl Harbor. They twisted and turned, but our pilots, veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, never missed. I watched Cornwall break in half. It took 7 minutes to sink. The ocean burned with oil fires for hours. 4 days later, on April 9th, Japanese carriers found the British Eastern Fleet's main force. What followed was the largest carrier battle to date. 27 British Blenheim bombers attacked the Japanese carriers without fighter escort. Japanese Zero fighters, flown by pilots with an average of 800 flight hours, slaughtered them. Of 27 British bombers, 21 were shot down. Not a single bomb hit a Japanese carrier. Not one. The British carrier, HMS Hermes, caught without aircraft, was sunk in 10 minutes by 85 Japanese dive bombers. It was the first purpose-built aircraft carrier in history, and it died without firing a shot in its own defense. Admiral Sir James Somerville, commanding the British Eastern Fleet, reported to the Admiralty, "The Japanese carrier force is the most formidable naval weapon in existence. Their pilots are superb, their aircraft excellent, their coordination flawless. We cannot contest them without American support. I am withdrawing to East Africa to prevent the annihilation of the Royal Navy's last significant fleet." The statistics told a story of complete Japanese dominance. In 6 months of operations, 5 Allied battleships sunk, 2 Allied aircraft carriers sunk, 7 Allied cruisers sunk, hundreds of merchant ships destroyed, 0 Japanese carriers lost, 0 Japanese battleships lost, Japanese pilot casualties, minimal, under 150 dead. Combat loss rate, less than 3%. Commander Mitsugu Kofukuda, air operations officer aboard Akagi, wrote in his diary on May 25, 1942, "Our pilots are invincible. The Americans send their boys up with 200 hours of flight time. Ours have 800. The Americans fly inferior aircraft. Ours are faster, more maneuverable, with better range. The Americans lack coordination. We have perfected the art of carrier warfare. They cannot win. The mathematics forbid it." The Kida Butai's confidence was absolute. They had faced the British Royal Navy, the world's largest and most experienced, and humiliated it. They had annihilated American forces across the Pacific. Their Zero fighters maintained a kill ratio of 12-1 against Allied aircraft. Their pilots were the best-trained naval aviators in history. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, flight commander aboard Hiryū, captured the prevailing attitude in a letter home dated May 28th. "The Americans are brave, but incompetent. Their pilots cannot shoot, cannot navigate, cannot coordinate attacks. We have met their bombers over and over. They die without inflicting damage. This war will be over by year's end. America cannot replace what we are destroying. They do not have our spirit, our training, or our skill." The Japanese Naval General Staff agreed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet and architect of Pearl Harbor, planned the Midway operation to finish what Pearl Harbor had started: the destruction of the American carrier force. Intelligence reported 3 American carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and possibly Yorktown, though she was believed heavily damaged from the Coral Sea battle. Against them, Yamamoto was committing 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, including the massive Yamato, 15 cruisers, 42 destroyers, and over 400 aircraft. The plan was elegant in its complexity. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American forces north. Then, Nagumo's 4 carriers would destroy Midway's defenses, forcing the American carriers to respond. When they appeared, Japanese submarines would spot them, and the Kido Butai would annihilate them. What could possibly go wrong? On May 27th, the anniversary of Japan's great victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, the fleet departed. Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge as the massive formation assembled. 4 carriers, their decks packed with aircraft. Behind them, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers. "We are invincible," Nagumo told his staff. "The Americans will come to us, and they will die." Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, recovering from appendicitis but determined to observe the battle, recorded the mood. Confidence bordered on arrogance. "We had crushed everyone who opposed us." Our pilots joked about how many American carriers each would sink. There was talk of being home by August, of the war ending before year's end. No one imagined we could lose. The thought was not just unlikely, it was impossible. Act 2. The First Cracks. June 3rd, 1942. The first sign that something was wrong came 700 miles from Midway, when the submarine USS Nautilus reported the Japanese fleet's position 24 hours earlier than expected. American codebreakers had already predicted the attack, but this early sighting meant Admiral Chester Nimitz's carriers were positioned perfectly for ambush. But Nagumo didn't know any of this. June 4th, 4:30 a.m. Nagumo launched the first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, including 36 Aichi-D, 3A Val dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B, 5 N-Kate torpedo bombers armed with bombs, and 36 Zero fighters. Lieutenant Tomonaga led the strike. At 5:34 a.m., radar on Midway detected the incoming raid at 93 miles. Every American aircraft on the atoll scrambled, 27 fighters, 38 bombers of various types. It was a chaotic, desperate launch of everything that could fly. What followed was massacre. The American fighters, a mix of obsolete F-2A Buffaloes and older F-4F Wildcats, flown by Marine pilots with minimal combat experience, climbed to intercept. The Japanese Zeros, flown by veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the Indian Ocean, were waiting. Captain Philip White, flying a Buffalo, radioed back to Midway. "Many Zeros. Jesus Christ, they're everywhere." The transmission ended. White's aircraft disintegrated under cannon fire from Lieutenant Masaji Suganami's Zero. In 6 minutes, the Japanese Zeros shot down 17 of 27 American fighters. Most American pilots never got a shot off. The few that did found their bullets seemed to pass through the Zeros without effect. Meanwhile, Japanese bombers destroyed fuel tanks, damaged the powerhouse, and killed the commanding officer of Marine Air Group 22. But they didn't destroy the airfield. Lieutenant Tomonaga radioed back to Akagi at 7 a.m. There is need for a second attack. This message would doom the Kido Butai. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo faced a dilemma. He had retained 108 aircraft for anti-ship work, armed with torpedoes in case American carriers appeared. But if he wanted to finish Midway, he needed to rearm them with bombs for ground targets. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made the decision. Rearm all aircraft with bombs for second Midway strike. Below decks, organized chaos began. Crews removed torpedoes from 54 Kate bombers, wheeling the massive weapons back to magazines and bringing up 800-kilogram bombs. The torpedoes, heavy and dangerous, were stacked temporarily on the hangar decks, while crews worked frantically to complete the rearming. This process, in the best conditions, took 90 minutes. At 7:28 a.m., everything changed. The scout plane from the cruiser Tone, which had launched 30 minutes late due to catapult problems, radioed, "Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots." Ships traveling that fast meant carriers. Nagumo ordered, "Ascertain ship types." At 7:45 a.m., Tone's scout reported, "The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier." A carrier. The Americans had a carrier. Nagumo immediately ordered, "Prepare to launch anti-ship attack." But his aircraft were in disarray. Half were armed with bombs, half with torpedoes. The first strike from Midway was returning, low on fuel, with damaged aircraft that needed to land immediately. At 7:50 a.m., Midway's revenge began. 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 4 B-26 Marauder bombers, flying at wave-top height, attacked the Japanese carriers. They came in without fighter escort, flying directly into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and Zeros. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol destroyed them methodically. 5 of 6 Avengers were shot down. 2 of 4 B-26s crashed into the sea. Not a single torpedo hit. But the attack disrupted Japanese operations. 1 B-26, piloted by Captain James Collins, pressed his attack through a curtain of fire. Witnesses on Akagi reported the bomber aimed directly at the carrier's bridge, riddled with holes, trailing smoke, making a suicide run. At the last second, it veered over the flight deck so low that personnel dove flat. It crashed into the sea 100 yards beyond the carrier. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, watching from the bridge, wrote, "The American pilot's courage was magnificent, but courage without skill is just elaborate suicide. He died for nothing." At 8 a.m., Nagumo recovered his Midway strike aircraft while under attack. Then came 16 Marine Corps SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Midway, led by Major Lofton Henderson. Again, no fighter escort. Again, the Zeros massacred them. Henderson's aircraft was shot down on the approach. 8 Marine dive bombers were destroyed. Not a single bomb hit a Japanese carrier. The survivors fled back to Midway, their radios full of desperate calls for help, descriptions of burning aircraft, friends dying. Then came 15 B-17 flying fortresses, bombing from 20,000 feet. They dropped 30 tons of bombs, 0 hits. High-altitude bombing against maneuvering ships proved useless. By 8:30 a.m., Nagumo had survived 3 American attacks without a scratch. His confidence, shaken briefly, returned. The Americans were brave, but incompetent. Their attacks were uncoordinated, their pilots poorly trained, their tactics suicidal. "The Americans are throwing their aircraft away," Nagumo told his staff. "This only confirms our superiority." At 8:35 a.m., Nagumo ordered the crucial decision: rearm all aircraft with torpedoes for anti-ship attack. The bombs that had been loaded were removed. Torpedoes were brought back up from magazines. The hangar decks became cluttered with ordnance as crews worked at maximum speed. On all 4 carriers, hangar decks were packed with aircraft, fuel lines connected, weapons stacked, damage control procedures abandoned in the rush to prepare the strike. By 9:18 a.m., the last aircraft from the Midway strike had landed. Nagumo ordered his carriers to turn into the wind to launch the anti-ship strike. At 10:20 a.m., he would launch everything. 108 aircraft that would destroy the American carriers. He never got the chance. At 9:25 a.m., American torpedo bombers appeared. VT-8 from Hornet, 15, TBD, Devastator torpedo bombers, obsolete, slow, flying without fighter escort. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led them straight at the carriers. The Zeros and anti-aircraft fire created a killing field. One by one, the American torpedo bombers died. Aircraft exploded, crashed into the ocean, cartwheeled across the waves trailing fire. In 4 minutes, 14 of 15 Devastators were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water, watching what came next. At 9:40 a.m., VT-6 from Enterprise attacked 14 Devastators. Again, the Zeros slaughtered them. 10 were shot down in minutes. 0 torpedo hits. At 10 a.m., VT-3 from Yorktown attacked 12 Devastators plus 6 Wildcat fighters for escort. The Wildcats were overwhelmed. The Devastators pressed through anyway. 10 were destroyed. 0 hits. Of 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked, 35 were destroyed. Not a single torpedo struck a Japanese carrier. Over 80 American pilots and aircrew died without inflicting any damage. On Akagi's bridge, Japanese officers allowed themselves to relax. The Americans had thrown everything at them and failed. Their carriers were unscathed. Their aircraft were armed and ready for launch. Victory was minutes away. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida recorded, "We had seen the Americans' best effort. It was pathetic. Their torpedo bombers were obsolete, their tactics suicidal, their coordination absent. Some officers were laughing, making jokes about American incompetence. The word spread through the ship. We are truly invincible." What no one on those 4 carriers realized was that the American torpedo bomber attacks, while futile, had pulled every Japanese Zero down to wave-top height. The combat air patrol that should have been stacked at multiple altitudes was concentrated at sea level, chasing the last torpedo bombers. The sky above the Japanese carriers was empty. At 10:22 a.m., lookouts on Akagi spotted aircraft diving from 14,000 feet. The Ichidi-3A dive bombers that had destroyed British cruisers, American battleships, and countless ships across 6 months were finally experiencing what their victims had felt. Terror. Act 3. 6 minutes of annihilation. 10:22 a.m. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, rolled inverted and dove on the Kido Butai. Simultaneously, 17 dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, attacked from a different angle. 50 American dive bombers screaming down from 14,000 feet at terminal velocity. No Zeros at altitude to stop them. The carriers below, their decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, turning desperately to evade torpedoes that were no longer coming. The Japanese carriers were death traps waiting to ignite. 10:22 a.m. Akagi. Lieutenant Richard Best led 3 SBD Dauntlesses against the flagship. At 1,500 feet, he released a 1,000-pound bomb. It fell perfectly. The bomb penetrated the flight deck near the aft elevator. It detonated in the upper hangar, directly amidst aircraft being fueled and armed with torpedoes. The explosion touched off a catastrophic chain reaction. Petty Officer Mitsuo Fuchida watched from the bridge. The flight deck erupted like a volcano. A massive fireball shot 500 feet into the air. The entire aft section of the ship disappeared in an instant. Men, aircraft, equipment, everything simply vanished in the explosion. Then, secondary explosions began, each one larger than the last. The torpedo warheads, stacked carelessly during the rearming operations, began cooking off. Each explosion was equivalent to 500 pounds of TNT. 18 torpedoes detonated in rapid succession. The entire hangar became an inferno, reaching temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 60 seconds, Akagi transformed from the flagship of an invincible fleet into a floating crematorium. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding Akagi, tried to fight the fires, but aviation fuel from ruptured lines spread flames faster than damage control teams could respond. The torpedoes they had so carefully loaded to kill American carriers were destroying their own ship. At 10:23 a.m., a second bomb hit forward, destroying the flight deck control and igniting more fires. Akagi's ability to launch aircraft died with that hit. The carrier that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was finished in 2 minutes. 10:24 a.m. Kaga. Kaga, the second carrier, died even faster. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson and his wingman scored 4 direct hits in under 30 seconds. The first bomb struck near the forward elevator, creating a hole 40 feet across. The second penetrated to the lower hangar, where armed Zero fighters were being fueled. The explosion destroyed 20 aircraft instantly and ruptured fuel lines that fed the growing inferno. The third bomb hit amidships, directly on the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his senior staff in a single blast. Kaga's command structure evaporated. The fourth bomb hit aft, igniting stacked ordnance that had been removed during the rearming operations. The 800-kilogram bombs, each containing 400 kilograms of explosive, detonated in sympathetic explosion. The stern of the ship lifted from the water as the blast vented downward through the hull. Kaga was doomed in 40 seconds. Petty Officer Taisuke Maruyama, stationed in damage control, survived and testified after the war. I was blown off my feet by the first explosion. The second came before I could stand, then the third. Each one was impossibly loud, impossibly hot. The ship was dying beneath us. Aircraft on the hangar deck were exploding. Fuel was everywhere. Torpedo warheads were cooking off. We couldn't fight it. We couldn't even reach the fires. The smoke was black, toxic, burning our lungs. Men were jumping overboard, their clothes on fire. The ship was an inferno from bow to stern in less than 2 minutes. 10:25 a.m. Sōryū. Sōryū, the fastest carrier in the Japanese fleet, survived longest, 3 minutes. Lieutenant Commander Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers attacked her, scoring 3 direct hits in rapid succession. The first bomb hit forward, penetrating to the lower hangar. The blast destroyed 9 Zero fighters being fueled for launch and ignited aviation gasoline that spread fire throughout the forward section. The second bomb hit amidships, destroying the main hangar and igniting stacked ordnance. The explosion was so violent, it buckled the flight deck upward, creating a hump that prevented any possibility of launching aircraft. The third bomb struck aft, near the engine room uptakes, destroying ventilation systems and allowing flames and toxic smoke to pour into engineering spaces. The engines continued running, but the men operating them began dying of smoke inhalation. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused to abandon ship, choosing instead to go down with Sōryū. His final order was simple: save yourselves. Ensign Taisuke Maruyama, one of the few survivors from Sōryū, described the scene. The ship was dying, but she was dying fast. The fires spread through the hangar bays faster than men could run. Explosions threw bodies and debris into the air. The heat was so intense that steel was melting. Men trapped below decks were screaming into voice pipes, begging us to save them. We couldn't. The fires were too intense, the explosions too frequent. We could only listen to them die. 10:26 a.m. 3 carriers burning. In 4 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers had been transformed into funeral pyres. The 4 ships that had dominated the Pacific were reduced to 3 blazing hulks and 1 survivor, Hiryū, which had been sailing separately from the others and escaped the initial attack. But the Americans weren't finished. At 10:26 a.m., 2 more bombs hit Kaga's bridge, killing every officer who had survived the first strike. At 10:27 a.m., another bomb struck Akagi near the bridge, forcing Admiral Nagumo to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. The admiral, who had commanded the most powerful carrier force in history, now commanded from a cruiser, watching 3 of his 4 carriers die. The mathematics of catastrophe were brutal. 3 Japanese fleet carriers carrying 178 aircraft, crewed by 2,150 sailors and 145 pilots, destroyed in 6 minutes by 50 American dive bombers. But the horror was just beginning. On all 3 burning carriers, damage control teams fought fires they could not control. Aviation fuel, stored in flexible tanks throughout the ships, had ruptured in the bomb blasts. The fuel poured through passageways, down companionways, creating rivers of fire that trapped men below decks. The torpedoes and bombs, stacked carelessly during the hasty rearming operations, continued exploding throughout the afternoon. Each explosion killed damage control parties and spread fires to new sections. Each explosion brought the carriers closer to their death throes. On Kaga, fires reached the forward magazine at 12:40 p.m. The explosion was apocalyptic. The entire bow section, weighing over 3,000 tons, lifted from the water and twisted sideways. The blast wave killed every man still alive in the forward half of the ship. Kaga sank at 7:25 p.m., taking 811 men to the bottom. On Akagi, Captain Aoki fought to save his ship until 4:30 p.m., when Admiral Yamamoto ordered the carrier abandoned. The Emperor's portrait was ceremonially transferred to a destroyer. At 5 p.m., destroyers prepared to scuttle the burning hulk with torpedoes, but Akagi refused to die quickly. It took 4 torpedo hits to sink her at 5:20 a.m. on June 5th. She took 267 men down with her, including many trapped below decks who had survived the fires but could not escape. On Sōryū, the end came fastest. Fires reached the main magazines at 7:13 p.m. The explosion broke the ship's back. Witnesses on nearby destroyers reported that Sōryū folded like a book, the bow and stern rising as the center collapsed. She sank in 3 minutes, taking 718 men with her, including Captain Yanagimoto, who was last seen on the bridge, sword in hand, going down with his ship. The cost of 6 minutes. By 10:28 a.m., the battle was essentially over, though no one yet realized it. 3 Japanese fleet carriers had been eliminated from the war. The pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, sunk Prince of Wales, and destroyed the British Eastern Fleet were dead or dying. The mechanics who could repair battle damage were burning below decks. The ordnance handlers who could arm aircraft were blown apart in magazine explosions. The mathematics were irrecoverable. Japan had entered the war with 10 carriers. 3 were now burning wrecks. The pilots who had died were irreplaceable. Japan had no training pipeline capable of producing pilots with 800 hours of flight time. The Americans were graduating pilots with 600 hours and improving every month. The Japanese training system was already strained before Midway. After losing 145 experienced pilots in 6 minutes, it would never recover. But Hiryū remained. 1 carrier, 18 Zero fighters, and 36 dive and torpedo bombers, against 3 American carriers. The Japanese weren't finished yet. Act 4. The final gasps. At 10:40 a.m., Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryū, ordered an immediate counterstrike. Every flyable aircraft would attack the American carriers. There would be no reserve, no second chance. This was desperation warfare. 18 Naval dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, launched at 10:58 a.m. They were led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, who understood this was likely a one-way mission. At 12 p.m., they found Yorktown. The American carrier's combat air patrol shot down 10 of 18 dive bombers, but the survivors scored 3 bomb hits. Yorktown, already damaged from the Coral Sea battle 3 weeks earlier, was crippled. She lost power, listed heavily, and appeared to be sinking. The Japanese pilots returned jubilant. 1 American carrier destroyed. 2 remained. At 12:45 p.m., Hiryū launched its final strike. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led them, even though his aircraft had been damaged in the morning strike on Midway and was leaking fuel. He knew he didn't have enough fuel to return. He attacked anyway. At 2:30 p.m., they found Yorktown again. The American carrier had partially recovered power and was making 20 knots. Tominaga's torpedo bombers pressed through intense anti-aircraft fire. 5 were shot down, but 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side. The carrier listed 26 degrees and lost all power. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandon ship. Lieutenant Tominaga's aircraft was hit during the attack. He pressed through anyway, released his torpedo, and crashed into the ocean. His body was never recovered. Hiryū's pilots returned, believing they had sunk 2 American carriers. The jubilation lasted 30 minutes. At 3 p.m., American scout planes located Hiryū. At 5 p.m., 24 dive bombers from Enterprise found her. 4 bombs hit in rapid succession, all in the forward and midships areas. The bombs penetrated to the hangars where armed aircraft were being prepared for a third strike. The explosions and fires that followed were identical to those that had killed Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū. Aviation fuel ignited. Torpedoes cooked off. The hangar became an inferno. Admiral Yamaguchi, watching his carrier die, made the decision to abandon ship at 2:30 a.m. on June 5th. He chose to go down with Hiryū, along with Captain Tomeo Kaku. They tied themselves to the bridge and sang the Japanese naval anthem as the ship sank at 9 a.m. Hiryū took 392 men to the bottom. The 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were all gone. The Kido Butai no longer existed. The irreplaceable losses. The 4 carriers were grievous losses, but Japan could theoretically build more carriers. What Japan could not replace were the men. 145 pilots killed or missing. These were not rookie aviators with 200 hours flight time. These were the elite. Veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raid. Pilots with 800 to 2,000 hours of flight experience. Each one had taken 5 years to train. Many had accumulated combat experience that made them worth 10 rookie pilots. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, one of the survivors, later wrote, "We lost not just pilots, but the men who trained pilots. The formation leaders, the tactical innovators, the veterans who could teach others how to survive. We lost decades of accumulated knowledge in 6 minutes." The maintenance crews were equally irreplaceable. 2,000 mechanics, ordnance handlers, and technicians who knew how to keep temperamental aircraft engines running, who could repair battle damage at sea, who could arm aircraft in minutes. These men had been with their aircraft since before Pearl Harbor. Their knowledge was experiential, gained through 18 months of continuous operations. It could not be replaced from manuals. Japan would build more carriers, but they would be crewed by mechanics with 6 months of training instead of 5 years. They would be flown by pilots with 300 hours instead of 800, and those differences would prove fatal in every subsequent carrier battle. Yamamoto's realization. 200 miles away, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto received reports of the disaster at 12:30 p.m. Initially, the reports were confused. 1 carrier burning, then 2, then 3. By 2 p.m., the truth was undeniable. 3 carriers gone. Hiryū under attack. Yamamoto had committed 7 battleships to the Midway operation, including the massive 72,000-ton Yamato with her 18-inch guns. But battleships were useless without air cover. The age of the battleship had ended at Pearl Harbor. Now, the age of Japanese carrier dominance had ended at Midway. At 7 p.m., Yamamoto ordered a general retreat. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled, including ships that could have reduced Midway to rubble, fled without firing a shot. Captain Yasumi Doi, operations officer on Yamato, recorded the scene. The admirals sat silently on the bridge as reports came in. 3 carriers sunk, Hiryū burning, 250 aircraft lost, thousands of men dead. We had the firepower to destroy the entire American fleet, but we couldn't use it without air cover. We retreated because the Americans controlled the sky. It was a new kind of warfare, and we had just learned we were no longer dominant. Act 5. The Aftermath and the Reckoning. June 7, 1942. The scale of the disaster became clear. 4 fleet carriers sunk. Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, Hiryū. 1 heavy cruiser sunk. Mikuma. 248 aircraft destroyed. 3,057 sailors and airmen killed, including 110 of Japan's most experienced pilots. American losses: 1 carrier sunk, Yorktown, which actually survived the battle only to be sunk by a submarine on June 7th. 1 destroyer sunk, 150 aircraft destroyed, 307 men killed. The exchange rate was catastrophic for Japan. For every American killed, 10 Japanese died. For every American aircraft lost, Japan lost 1.7 aircraft plus the irreplaceable pilots. But the numbers only told part of the story. Japan's naval construction capacity could not replace 4 fleet carriers quickly. The carriers under construction wouldn't be ready until 1944. Meanwhile, American shipyards were building Essex-class fleet carriers at a rate that would eventually reach 1 per month. Japan's pilot training pipeline was already stretched thin. Before Midway, they were graduating 100 pilots per month with 500 to 600 hours of flight time, barely sufficient to be combat effective. After Midway, they increased graduation to 180 pilots per month, but reduced training hours to 300. The quality gap became a death sentence. The strategic implications were immediate. Japan could no longer conduct offensive carrier operations. The Kido Butai, which had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, no longer existed. Every subsequent carrier battle would be defensive, reactive, desperate. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, assessed the damage in a report to Naval General Staff on June 15th. The loss of 4 carriers can be replaced within 2 years with maximum industrial effort. The loss of 145 experienced pilots cannot be replaced in 10 years. We have lost the core of our naval aviation capability. All future operations must be conducted with this reality in mind. We are now fighting with diminished capacity against an enemy whose capacity grows daily. Conclusion: the echoes that never stopped. The Battle of Midway lasted 3 days, but it was decided in 6 minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942. In those 360 seconds, the entire trajectory of the Pacific War changed. Japan would build more carriers. Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku would join the fleet. But they would never again achieve the coordination, the experience, the lethality of the Kido Butai. The pilots who flew from their decks had 300 hours of training, not 800. The mechanics who maintained them had months of experience, not years. The difference was measurable in every engagement. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, 2 years after Midway, American carrier pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft fell from the sky in droves. Of 373 Japanese aircraft launched, 330 were destroyed. American losses: 29 aircraft. The kill ratio that had once favored Japan, 12-1, had reversed catastrophically. The veterans of Midway who survived the war never forgot those 6 minutes. Lieutenant Richard Best, who had put the bomb into Akagi's flight deck, flew one more mission at Midway before being medically retired with tuberculosis contracted from faulty oxygen equipment. He survived until 2001, living long enough to see his actions recognized as among the most consequential in naval history. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floated in the water throughout the battle, watching the Japanese carriers burn. He was rescued the next day and returned to combat, flying fighters for the remainder of the war. He never stopped telling the story of his squadron's sacrifice, ensuring that the 29 men who died with him were never forgotten. Wade McCluskey, who led the Enterprise dive bombers to their targets despite fuel running critically low, received the Navy Cross. His decision to continue searching for the Japanese carriers, even when it meant his aircraft might not have fuel to return, changed history. On the Japanese side, the survivors carried different burdens. Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and witnessed Midway's disaster from Akagi's bridge, spent the rest of his life analyzing what went wrong. In his post-war writings, he identified the fatal decisions, the delayed scout plane, the rearming order, the lack of doctrine for handling unexpected situations. "We were tactically brilliant, but strategically blind," Fuchida wrote in 1955. "We trained to execute perfect attacks, but never considered what would happen when perfection failed. The Americans were less skilled, but more adaptable. When their torpedo bombers failed, their dive bombers succeeded. When Plan A failed, they had Plans B through Z. We had only Plan A, and when it collapsed, we had nothing." Admiral Yamamoto survived Midway by 1 year. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down, killing the architect of Pearl Harbor and Midway. His death was the direct result of American codebreakers reading Japanese communications, the same intelligence advantage that had set the trap at Midway. The 4 carriers lost at Midway were never recovered. Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū rest on the Pacific floor at depths exceeding 17,000 feet. In 1999, a deep-sea expedition located Kaga's wreckage, finding the carrier remarkably intact, sitting upright on the bottom. The wreck site is considered a war grave, protected by international agreement. The mathematical reality of Midway is inescapable. Japan entered the battle with 4 fleet carriers and left with 0. America entered with 3 carriers and left with 2 operational, Enterprise and Hornet. Yorktown was fatally damaged, but later sunk by submarine. The material exchange heavily favored America, but the real calculation went deeper. American shipyards were building Essex-class carriers that would enter service in 1943. By war's end, the U.S. Navy would operate 28 fleet carriers. Japan's entire carrier construction from 1942 to 1945 would produce only 10 carriers, most completed too late or with inadequate air groups. The pilot mathematics were even worse. America's training pipeline graduated 15,000 pilots in 1942 and would increase to 30,000 annually by 1944. Japan's entire pilot training capacity peaked at 2,500 per year. The Americans could afford to lose pilots in training accidents and combat losses and still increase overall capability. Japan could not replace losses at any rate approaching American production. In the end, Midway proved that industrial capacity matters more than tactical brilliance. Japan's pilots were better trained, more experienced, more skilled. But America had more of everything. More carriers, more aircraft, more pilots, more fuel, more ordnance. The arithmetic of attrition favored the side that could sustain losses and return stronger. 6 minutes at Midway demonstrated a brutal truth about modern warfare. It is not won by the bravest or most skilled, but by those who can build faster, replace losses quicker, and sustain operations longer. Japan won every tactical engagement from December 1941 to June 1942. But they were losing the strategic war from the moment American factories mobilized. Those 6 minutes on June 4th simply revealed what was already inevitable. Today, the Battle of Midway is studied in military academies worldwide as a lesson in the importance of intelligence, the value of persistence, and the reality that wars are won not by perfect plans, but by adaptation when plans fail. The American torpedo bomber crews who died without scoring a single hit were not failures. They were heroes whose sacrifice pulled Japanese defenses down to sea level, creating the opening that dive bombers exploited. Their deaths had meaning. The Japanese sailors who burned to death below decks on 4 carriers were not cowards. They were professionals, caught in circumstances beyond their control, victims of decisions made by commanders who believed their own invincibility. War does not care about courage, honor, or righteousness. It cares about tonnage, production capacity, and mathematics. Midway taught both sides this lesson in the cruelest way possible. The echoes of those 6 minutes reverberated through the Pacific War and beyond. Every carrier battle afterward was shaped by the knowledge that carrier warfare was sudden, violent, and unforgiving. Entire fleets could be annihilated in minutes. Admirals on both sides became cautious, conservative, understanding that one mistake could mean total loss. The lesson endures. In modern warfare, battles are still decided in minutes by weapons that strike without warning. Carrier operations remain high-risk, high-reward endeavors where small margins determine enormous outcomes. 6 minutes, 360 seconds, 4 carriers, 3,057 men, 248 aircraft. The mathematics of Midway still echo through time, a permanent reminder that empires can be destroyed faster than they can be built, that dominance can evaporate in moments, and that history's pivots often occur too quickly for those experiencing them to comprehend what has happened. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered those 6 minutes as the dominant carrier force in the world. It emerged as a dying force, surviving on momentum, unable to replace what it had lost, watching American power grow exponentially while its own capacity withered. By war's end, the mathematics were complete. Japan's carrier fleet destroyed. America's carrier fleet, 99 carriers of all types, more than all other nations combined. The 6 minutes at Midway didn't just destroy 4 carriers, they destroyed Japan's ability to win the Pacific War. The echoes have never stopped. In the end, Midway proved that the most dangerous enemy is not the one you underestimate, but the one whose capacity to respond exceeds your ability to sustain. Japan had the best pilots, the best tactics, 6 months of unbroken victories. But America had the factories, the resources, and the willingness to learn from failure. 6 minutes was all it took to prove which would matter more. The past doesn't just speak, it screams. And at Midway, it screamed in 6 minutes of fire and destruction that changed everything. This has been Echoes of Time Unfolded. Subscribe for more stories that echo through eternity. The past is never truly past.